From Park Thrillers blog, I'm Sean Smith, and this is National Park Talk. Grizzly bear. What comes to mind when you hear that term? For some, it's a marauding monster, hell-bent on killing humans, an animal that must be managed to ensure public safety. For others, it's a symbol of wilderness and the past, an animal that must be managed to protect some of our best wild places. Just a little more than 200 years ago, 100,000 grizzly bears roamed the North American continent. They could be found as far east as the Dakotas and stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Through the spread of civilization, today there are only a couple thousand grizzly bears, and they can be found in only a few select places in the continental United States, such as Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. In 1975, the number of wild bears in Yellowstone had dropped to a little more than 100, and the federal government, through its authorities under the Endangered Species Act, stepped in to protect the bears. Since then, through concerted management, work with states and federal partners such as the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service has grown that number of bears to more than 700. And now the Fish and Wildlife Service says they are recovered and can be removed from the endangered species list. But are they? What are the long-term plans for the bear? What are the risks of removing federal protection? And how can you get involved? We will answer these and other questions today on National Park Talk. During the Lewis and Clark expedition about 200 years ago, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark described in their journals coming across a large carnivore that they'd heard about called the grizzly bear. They'd seen and talked to Native Americans in their travels talking about when they went out hunting these bears, it took 6 to 10 Native Americans to bring them down with bow and arrows. Lewis and Clark weren't concerned about the bears because they believed their muskets were up to the job, but on one occasion it took at least 10 shots to take down a grizzly bear, and the expedition soon developed a healthy respect for the bears that they would carry through the rest of their expedition. Over the next 200 years, the bear's population, as I mentioned, dropped from about 100,000 individuals to roughly about 1,000 in scattered places by the late 1970s. Bears are solitary creatures, grizzly bears in particular, needing large tracts of land to survive, sometimes hundreds of square miles, and they are easily susceptible to disturbance. Habitat that has changed for development for homes or farms or industry push out bears. Roads are another problem. Research shows that road densities can have a huge impact on bear survival. In a nutshell, the more roads you have in an area, the fewer grizzly bears you're going to have. And bears, contrary to popular opinion, are not primarily carnivores. They do eat meat and will take down larger prey like deer and elk if it's available. However, grizzly bears are predominantly omnivores, generalists. They will eat just about anything, with the majority of their diet coming from plants, pine nuts, small mammals like marmots, and insects. Unlike wolves, bears have smaller birth numbers. A typical female grizzly bear will have 1 or 2 cubs every other year. She will spend the next 2 years raising her cubs alone before she is ready to mate again. By comparison, wolves can average 4 to 7 pups every year. With the help of the rest of the pack, the pups are ready to basically be independent by the end of their first year. These differences mean grizzly bear recovery, as compared to wolves, is slow and more tenuous. In the next segment, we will talk about what the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and others have been doing over these past several decades to stabilize the grizzly bear population. Bears have a fairly simple goal when they exit their hibernation den in the spring. It's to find food, put on fat, mate, find a den site, survive hibernation, and repeat. Disruption of any one of these activities can threaten grizzly bears' viability, and sadly, every one, especially their food sources, are under threat. In Yellowstone, as elsewhere, grizzly bear diet is fairly diverse. They eat a wide variety of foods. Grizzly bears feast on white bark pine nuts, small mammals and rodents, cutworm moths, and cutthroat trout. Unfortunately, for a whole host of reasons, these food sources are under threat. In Yellowstone, as I mentioned before, a significant food source for the grizzly bear is the cutthroat trout. It's a native fish to Yellowstone Lake. In the spring, cutthroat trout migrate from the lake into the lake's feeding streams and rivers to spawn. During this time, the grizzly bear, like their cousin bears in Alaska, fish for the cutthroat, which provide a high source of protein and energy. Several years ago, lake trout were found in Yellowstone Lake. The suspicion is that some angler chucked these non-native fish into the lake to create an additional fishery. Unfortunately, these new fish have had a negative impact upon the cutthroat, which in turn is negatively impacting the grizzly bear. Lake trout, by and large, are a much more aggressive fish than the cutthroat. They tend to eat the cutthroat by the buckets. Some samples of lake trout have been found with dozens of cutthroat fry in their stomachs. The lake trout is a new predator to the lake, and it puts negative pressure on the cutthroat's populations. What's more, the cutthroat, as we mentioned, spawn in the lake's feeder streams and making themselves available for the grizzly bears to catch. By comparison, the lake trout spawn deep in the lake and are never really available to the grizzly bear to eat. The Park Service recognizes this threat that lake trout poses to the cutthroat trout. It has an active management program to eradicate the lake trout, including unlimited fish catch limits, gill netting, and the destruction of some of the lake trout's spawning grounds. Unfortunately, nothing to date has really worked. Lake trout numbers appear unaffected, and as such, a primary food source of the bears remains under threat. Other food sources like the white bark pine nut and the cutworm moth are also under threat, and as such, the bears' food sources are tenuous at best. As I mentioned before, food is just one aspect of the bear's life cycle. Finding good and undisturbed den sites, compatible mates, and suitable habitat are also shaky. It appears nothing about the bear's future is certain. So what is the Fish and Wildlife Service proposing? Why do they believe their new plan will sustain bears for the indefinite future? We will look at these questions and more after the break. On March 3rd, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a press release announcing its intention to delist the grizzly bear and as such remove federal protection of the bears currently afforded them by the Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service has reached this decision after years of research, numerous investigations, millions spent on their protection and habitat monitoring. As we mentioned before, Yellowstone grizzly bear numbers have risen from roughly about 130 in the mid-1970s to about 700 today. The bears have doubled their range during that time to include an area larger than New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island combined. The Fish and Wildlife Service also reports that the Yellowstone ecosystem is reaching its carrying capacity for bears. So in order to maintain a stable population, the Fish and Wildlife Service has released a plan they say will maintain the bears into the future. Well, what are the particulars of these plans? To start, the plan calls for the setting of a baseline population of 500 bears to be maintained throughout the greater Yellowstone area. In order to maintain this number, extensive monitoring will take place of not only the bears' population, but also the habitat quality. Bears without sufficient quality habitat are not going to be viable. So Fish and Wildlife Service proposes sending out monitors to look at the availability of food sources, denning sites, sites that have very few roads, those sorts of things. And through that monitoring, if the bear population is found to drop to unsustainable levels, federal protections can be reestablished. The plan also calls for setting up migration opportunities for bears, allowing them to mix with those bears outside the core areas. However, the plan also calls for the state of Montana to transplant bears if the population drops too low or the genetic viability is compromised. So if we get a number below 500, or if the population is seeing interbreeding problems, Montana is authorized to bring in bears from outside of the Yellowstone area to augment and supplement that population. The plan does allow for grizzly bear hunting seasons to be established, and those could be established anywhere except in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks proper. However, restrictions on the killing of bears to protect livestock or poaching will still be prohibited. An interagency grizzly bear study team will continue to operate once the federal protections are removed. This team will provide information on the bears' populations, their habitat quality, and present reports and recommendations to the wildlife managers on how to fix those problems. In the end, the Fish and Wildlife Service plan rests on a strong partnership among the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, state wildlife programs, and tribal entities to ensure the bear's future. Sounds good. Sounds like success. But in the next segment, we'll look at a few of the holes in this plan and where bears' future might still be at risk. So as we saw in the last segment, the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed a plan that they believe will sustain grizzly bears in the Yellowstone area for years to come. However, this plan is based on a number of assumptions that, if all doesn't go right, significantly undermine the plan and its ability to maintain the species. Let's look at a few of those assumptions. First, the maintained bear population is based upon a firm number of 500. It sounds like this is a hard and fast line that once crossed will trigger more protection. However, that number isn't as firm as it sounds. In particular, because the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't truly know how many bears are in the area, rather than count all of the animals in the area, the Fish and Wildlife Service counts the number of female bears with cubs, the distribution of those bears throughout the area, and a count of any bear mortality to estimate the bear population. So a firm understanding of the number of bears in the area simply doesn't exist. It could be higher or it could be lower than projected numbers. We simply don't know. However, management action depends upon those firm numbers, and in particular, maintaining 500 bears. It's possible that debates over the number of bears, how they are counted, where they are found, could erupt once protections are eliminated, slowing or even stopping needed management action. Next, the plan assumes funding will be available to execute the plan. For example, if genetic viability is threatened, the plan calls for Montana to transplant bears into Yellowstone to offset the problem. However, if this transplanting follows similar efforts to transplant wolves or other carnivores, such as the fisher, it could take years to study and millions of dollars to carry out the actual moving of the bears. A similar grizzly bear transplant effort would cost the state of Montana at a minimum tens of thousands of dollars to carry out. Money that is currently not allocated to this project, and with no guarantee it will ever be allocated. Third, the plan will move from one overarching agency with management authority, that being the Fish and Wildlife Service, to multiple agencies with management responsibility. These agencies have differing interpretations of policy and regulations, differing agendas, and most troubling, differing commitments to grizzly bear recovery. Going from one cook to multiple cooks is more often than not a significant problem. Fourth, the plan calls for federal action to be reestablished if protections are triggered. However, to reestablish federal protection, multiple and significant hurdles have to be cleared. The process first allows for any of the roughly 20 agencies that would have a seat at the grizzly bear management table to start the review process. Once started, a review is produced and recommendations from this review are presented to all the stakeholders. However, for those recommendations to be forwarded to the Fish and Wildlife Service for federal action, a majority of the stakeholders must agree to this course of action. After that, a petition to the Fish and Wildlife Service can be submitted asking for a relisting of the bears. The flaw here is the process is dependent upon the subjective monitoring information mentioned before. Differences of opinion on population numbers and habitat quality are likely to make achieving a majority of stakeholders extremely difficult. The Fish and Wildlife Service can take action independently of the stakeholders or at the request of citizens if it is warranted and or if emergency action is necessary. In such instances, the Fish and Wildlife Service can impose immediate action lasting up to 240 days. If longer time is needed, the Fish and Wildlife Service could initiate a rulemaking to extend emergency restrictions. However, like the stakeholder process, the Fish and Wildlife Service initiated process is undermined by similar flaws. What's more, a future presidential administration is not bound to interpret the findings of a previous administration in similar fashion. One administration could view population and habitat quality dramatically different than previous administrations. What's more, while the Fish and Wildlife Service could act to prevent or confront emergency conditions, rulemaking, even under the best conditions, can take months, if not years, to complete. The conditions that started the process may be irreversible by the time the final rulemaking is complete. Finally, every one of the actions taken by the stakeholders is likely to be subject to citizen and government appeal. Citizens' appeals and lawsuits could drag out a review process for years, preventing the Fish and Wildlife Service from even initiating emergency action. So what can be done? First, I'd recommend maintaining federal protection of the grizzly bears. It's taken humans less than 200 years to remove nearly 100,000 bears from the continental United States. However, it's taken more than 30 years to return the number to more than a few hundred in Yellowstone alone. The point being, it's easier to wipe out bears than to rebuild their population. If that's the case, the people responsible for maintaining these animals should err on the side of caution. And unfortunately, the proposed plan doesn't do this, in my opinion. The plan assumes too much, assumptions that, quite frankly, put the bears at risk. However, if the plan is going to go forward, a few tweaks would make it significantly better. First, get assurances up front that states, tribes, and others are committing significant funds and resources to grizzly bear management. No funds, no plan. Next, require hard counts of the bears. Estimates can vary widely and are subject to interpretation. No hard counts, no action. Third, and probably most importantly, put the onus of action on the states and tribes to maintain the delisting rather than on the feds to reestablish the protections. Under the current plan, the incentives to protect the bears rest on those who want to see the populations maintained. As stated before, this process creates significant hurdles to taking proactive management action in favor of the bears. Rather, the Fish and Wildlife Service should propose a system that would automatically reestablish protections if certain conditions aren't met. The subtle shift would put pressure upon the states and tribes to make certain bear population and habitat isn't compromised. Otherwise, restrictions will be put back in place. The Fish and Wildlife Service will be taking comments on this plan through May 3rd, and I would encourage everyone to send their thoughts in to the agency. Comments should be sent to bit.ly/grizzlybearplan. That's bit.ly/GRIZZLYBEARPLAN. To get more information on the plan, please contact the Fish and Wildlife Service Serena Baker at SERENA_BAKER at fws.gov. Thank you for listening. National Park Talk is produced and recorded in Western Washington in the shadow of Mount Rainier. To learn more about National Park Talk, please visit our website at seandavidsmith.blogspot.com or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ @ParkThrillers. To find us on Twitter, search for @ParkThrillers. I'm Sean Smith. Thanks again for listening to National Park Talk.